January 1943. Detroit Arsenal Tank Plant, Michigan. Snow drifts against the corrugated walls as floodlights burn through the industrial fog. Inside, the night shift roars to life. Pneumatic hammers, welding torches, conveyor belts trembling under steel weight. Sparks fall like orange rain over lines of women in heavy gloves and oil-stained coveralls. The air smells of metal, sweat, and machine oil, the scent of a nation at war. On the far end of the assembly hall, another M4 Sherman tank rolls forward, freshly painted, its gun still warm from test firing. A young woman, face streaked with soot, wipes her brow and signs off the inspection sheet. She's one of thousands, part of an army behind the army, working 12-hour shifts under posters that read, "We can do it." That same week, deep inside a cold German command post, Wehrmacht officers study intelligence reports. One line stops them cold. U.S. output, 1,000 tanks per month. When the Second World War erupted in 1939, the United States stood on the sidelines, industrial giant but militarily modest. Its army ranked 17th in the world. Yet behind the apparent calm, a sleeping industrial power waited, filled with factories, machines, and a workforce that understood how to build, not destroy. Detroit, Cleveland, Chicago, names that once symbolized automobiles and consumer prosperity, were about to become the heart of a global war machine. By the time France fell in June 1940, American leaders saw the scale of the coming conflict. The arsenal of democracy, as President Roosevelt called it, would not be a slogan. It would be a production miracle. Car assembly lines would become tank foundries. Washing machine plants would forge bomb casings. Typewriter factories would make machine guns. And behind every conversion stood one truth. Men were leaving for battlefields. Someone had to replace them. At first, government and industry doubted women could handle the physical labor or technical precision required. Those doubts vanished quickly. Between 1941 and 1943, millions of American women entered factories, hangars, and shipyards. They learned to rivet, weld, blueprint, and calibrate heavy machinery with astonishing speed. The United States Employment Service established training programs in nearly every industrial state. Within months, they were producing parts with tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. Nowhere was the transformation more visible than in Detroit, the heart of America's automotive empire. The Detroit Arsenal Tank Plant, designed by Chrysler engineers and managed under the Army Ordnance Department, became the world's first factory dedicated entirely to tank mass production. The first M3 rolled out in April 1941. By 1942, it was replaced by the M4 Sherman, the backbone of Allied armored forces. The plant's rhythm was relentless, 24 hours a day, 3 shifts, 7 days a week. A full Sherman tank, 30 tons of steel, hundreds of components, rolled off the line roughly every hour. Conveyor belts carried engine blocks past sparks and stamping presses. The sound was deafening, but to many who worked there, it was the sound of hope. Women made up over 40% of the workforce at the arsenal by mid-1943. Some were widows, others teenagers, many mothers, all of them united by urgency and purpose. Their efficiency came not only from patriotism, but from process. American manufacturing embraced standardization. Engineers simplified designs for mass production, ensuring that parts from any plant would fit any vehicle on the front. The Germans, by contrast, prized precision craftsmanship, but it came at a cost. Each Panther or Tiger required more man-hours, specialized components, and delicate tolerances. The U.S. built Shermans like cars. Germany built Panzers like art pieces. In total war, the difference was decisive. The U.S. War Production Board coordinated resources at a scale no nation had ever attempted. Raw materials were rationed, blueprints shared, supply chains standardized, factory output was tracked daily, charts pinned beside slogans like, "Speed the victory." Quality inspectors, often women, carried clipboards through the din, measuring welds and bolts against military tolerances. When errors appeared, they were corrected on the spot. Speed never meant carelessness. Meanwhile, on the front lines, reports filtered back of German tanks dominating early battles. The sleek Panzer IV, the monstrous Tiger. American officers feared their Shermans might never stand a chance. But strategists knew numbers, not single duels, would decide the war. For every Tiger destroyed, 2 or 3 Shermans might fall, yet replacements kept arriving faster than German crews could repair or refuel. The secret lay not just in steel, but in system. Chrysler's engineers divided tank assembly into modular stages: hull, turret, drivetrain, electrics, allowing parallel work streams. This minimized downtime and maximized output. In January 1943 alone, more than 2,000 Shermans rolled from American plants. The Detroit Arsenal led the charge, followed by Lima, Pressed Steel, Baldwin Locomotive, and Fisher Body. Inside the German High Command, such numbers defied belief. How could a nation an ocean away, under no immediate threat, outproduce the Reich so completely? The answer, hidden behind those factory gates, was the mobilization of an entire society, including millions who had never before been allowed near a lathe, a forge, or a turret ring. It was the moment America's industrial heart began to beat for war, a steady, thunderous rhythm that no enemy could silence. Across the Atlantic, Germany faced a different kind of battle. Not just against enemies on distant fronts, but against its own industrial limitations. By 1943, the once formidable German armaments machine was straining under immense pressure. When Albert Speer took over as Minister of Armaments and War Production in 1942, he inherited a system that glorified engineering brilliance but punished efficiency. German factories were scattered across occupied Europe, each producing different components, often by hand, with minimal standardization. Skilled workers were being drafted into the Wehrmacht. Bombers from the Royal Air Force and the U.S. 8th Air Force pounded the industrial Ruhr night after night, turning precision plants into smoking ruins. Speer's reports from that time read like a race against destruction. Production graphs fluctuated violently. Tank output rising one month, collapsing the next after an air raid or transport failure. Replacement machinery had to be built, installed, and trained on, often within weeks. Despite his remarkable administrative skill, Speer faced a truth he could not escape. The Reich system was built for artistry, not mass production. The Tiger I tank embodied this contradiction perfectly. With its thick armor and 88mm gun, it was a battlefield terror, nearly invincible from the front. But every Tiger required over 300,000 man-hours to build. Its gearbox alone involved 100 precision-machined parts. The Panther, introduced in 1943, was even more complex. While technically superb, both designs consumed immense resources: molybdenum, nickel, high-grade steel, all increasingly scarce under Allied blockade. By contrast, the American M4 Sherman was a study in practical simplicity. Its welded hull could be produced by any plant capable of building locomotives. Its radial engine, adapted from aircraft models, was reliable and easily replaced. Standardized bolts, bearings, and fittings meant any damaged tank could be repaired quickly, often using parts from another model. The Germans sneered at the Sherman as inferior, but the battlefield would prove that quantity and reliability could defeat mechanical perfection. Speer's memos to Hitler in late 1943 carried an undertone of disbelief at Allied production totals. The United States had turned its entire civilian economy into a single, coordinated machine. While Speer struggled to rebuild bombed factories, American industry was opening new ones. The War Production Board authorized massive facilities in Chicago, Lima, and Grand Blanc, each designed for continuous, modular output. The workforce was trained, fed, and mobilized with military precision. And it wasn't just numbers that shocked the Germans, it was who was building them. Inside the Ford Willow Run plant, women outnumbered men on many lines. They operated cranes, guided welding rigs, and maintained hydraulic presses. At General Motors, women ordnance workers, the WOWs, became national icons. Photographs showed them smiling beside freshly completed tanks and aircraft. But behind the propaganda posters lay exhaustion, danger, and pride. They worked 12-hour shifts, breathing fumes, handling molten metal, and enduring temperatures that could exceed 100 degrees. Yet morale remained high. The cultural shift was enormous. Before the war, a woman lifting a rivet gun would have been unthinkable. By 1943, it was patriotism in action. Newspapers celebrated the girls who build the guns that win the battles. And while pay inequality persisted, the sheer visibility of women in heavy industry redefined gender roles across the nation. Meanwhile, Germany turned increasingly to forced labor, prisoners, foreign workers, concentration camp inmates, under conditions that ensured neither efficiency nor quality. While American welders were rewarded with bonuses and victory pins, their German counterparts worked under threat. Machines could be repaired, but morale could not. In one telling report, a captured German officer admitted his disbelief. "Your country builds tanks faster than we can burn them." It wasn't bravado, it was resignation. By 1944, the United States was producing more tanks, planes, and trucks than all Axis nations combined. The Detroit arsenal alone had turned out over 22,000 tanks, more than Germany's total wartime Tiger and Panther production combined. It was an industrial revolution conducted under floodlights, fueled by caffeine, overtime, and a shared conviction that every rivet could shorten the war. As Allied armor rumbled toward Normandy, the outcome of that industrial duel was already written, not in strategy memos or battlefield reports, but in the echoing clang of America's factories. The stage was set to see how this human, tactical, and technological miracle changed the course of the war itself. The human angle, the women behind the steel. By 1943, the American home front had become its own battlefield. The clatter of tools replaced the crack of rifles, and the glow of welding torches mirrored the flashes on distant fronts. In the massive sheds of the Detroit Arsenal, Lima, and Fisher body plants, tens of thousands of women stood shoulder to shoulder, hair wrapped in scarves, faces streaked with soot. They were no longer secretaries or housewives. They were industrial soldiers. Each one had her post, riveting plates, calibrating machine parts, inspecting weld seams with a magnifying glass. Many had never worked outside their homes before. Now they could identify alloys by color, measure thickness by touch, and read blueprints as fluently as recipes. They carried lunch pails instead of handbags, steel-toed boots instead of heels. The government's propaganda captured their spirit perfectly. The iconic Rosie the Riveter was not fiction. She was millions strong. Behind the posters, however, were grueling realities: 12-hour shifts, fatigue, burns, and backaches. Accidents were common, yet the women endured, driven by duty and pride. For many, a brother, husband, or son fought overseas. Every tank completed was a personal contribution to their safety. They developed an unspoken rhythm. Teamwork honed to precision. One woman welded, another ground smooth, another inspected. The line moved, hour after hour, day after day. Overtime was offered, but most didn't need encouragement. They knew that somewhere in Tunisia, Italy, or Normandy, their work could mean survival. In canteens, laughter mixed with exhaustion. War bond drives offered brief reprieve. Music, speeches, patriotic films. But when the sirens sounded shift change, the factory thunder resumed. America's industrial miracle was not powered by machines alone. It was driven by human resolve, a quiet determination that outpaced even the most advanced German engineering. The tactical angle, why quantity became strategy, on the battlefield, steel mattered. But so did arithmetic. The U.S. Army Ordnance Department understood a hard truth early on. The Allies didn't need a tank better than the Panzer. They needed one that could be built faster, repaired faster, and delivered faster. The M4 Sherman wasn't invincible. German crews nicknamed it Tommy Cooker, a grim reference to how easily it could burn when hit. But what German commanders feared wasn't the Sherman's armor. It was its ubiquity. Every time a panzer column destroyed a handful of Shermans, dozens more appeared days later. This was no accident of fate. American strategy was logistical warfare, the idea that wars are won not only by fighting, but by feeding the fight. While Germany measured victory in kills, America measured it in replacements. Factories at home synchronized with depots abroad. Parts, engines, tracks, and ammunition flowed across oceans like clockwork. In North Africa, 1943, Allied tank losses were severe during the early encounters. Yet U.S. supply ships brought replacements faster than German engineers could repair damaged Panzers. In Sicily and Italy, Shermans dominated by sheer endurance. Crews learned to use mobility, coordination, and overwhelming support fire to offset inferior armor. By the time of D-Day in June 1944, this doctrine was perfected. Each armored division carried dedicated recovery units and spare parts convoys. Damaged Shermans were towed, repaired, and redeployed within 24 to 48 hours. German units, by contrast, left crippled Tigers behind because fuel and tow vehicles were scarce. Quantity became the ultimate form of quality. The German High Command realized too late that the true weapon of the Allies wasn't just the tank. It was the system that kept them coming. The technological angle, the assembly line of victory. The battlefield was where tanks fought. The assembly line was where wars were truly won. The genius of American production lay not in complexity, but in standardization. Before the war, the auto industry had already mastered mass assembly, a culture of moving belts, interchangeable parts, and time-motion precision. The War Department harnessed this expertise completely. At the Detroit Arsenal, Chrysler engineers broke the M4 Sherman's design into modular components. The hull, turret, engine, and transmission were built simultaneously in different sections. Precision gauges ensured compatibility. A part built in Michigan fit perfectly with one from Illinois. Every step was timed, measured, improved. Even the tools evolved. Rivets gave way to welded seams, saving time and weight. Prefabricated armor plates arrived pre-shaped. Electric cranes swung turrets into place with ballet-like precision. Inspectors carried micrometers and clipboards, not rifles. Yet their work was as vital as any soldier's. The entire operation ran like a living organism. Each factory shift overlapped the next, ensuring the line never slept. Engineers studied breakdown reports from the front and redesigned parts mid-war. New models, the M4A3, M4A4, rolled out with better engines, thicker armor, and upgraded guns. Innovation moved as fast as the conveyor. The result? By 1944, U.S. plants produced nearly 50,000 Sherman tanks, enough to equip not only American but also British, Free French, and Soviet units. Germany's vaunted design superiority meant little. When its total Tiger and Panther output barely exceeded $10,000, the Allies had turned Fordist production into a weapon. Every assembly line a front line, every worker a combatant, and behind those machines stood the unlikeliest of soldiers, the women, who learned to build the weapons that would crush fascism. The story of American industrial might was no longer about who could design the best tank, but who could build enough to outlast the war itself. The leadership angle, managing a nation at full throttle. The transformation of American industry during World War II did not happen by accident. It was led by engineers, executives, and administrators who saw the war as an engineering problem to be solved, not merely a moral one to be fought. At the top stood men like William S. Knudsen, a Danish immigrant and former president of General Motors. When Roosevelt summoned him to Washington in 1940, Knudsen left behind one of the highest-paying jobs in America to work for a government salary of $1 per year. His task: mobilize U.S. industry faster than any nation in history. He did. Knudsen's philosophy was simple. You can't build tanks in Washington. You build them where they know how to build cars. He assembled a team of industrial leaders, Charles Sorensen from Ford, K.T. Keller from Chrysler, and others, and gave them authority to act. The result was an unprecedented collaboration between government and private industry. They implemented the learning curve principle, the idea that every time cumulative production doubled, efficiency improved by a fixed percentage. Mistakes became data, every error recorded, every bottleneck analyzed. By 1943, tank production time had been halved without sacrificing quality. Meanwhile, the War Production Board, led by Donald Nelson, coordinated 90,000 suppliers feeding into thousands of assembly lines. Resource conflicts were resolved not through politics, but logistics. Steel allocations, rubber distribution, fuel rations, all flowed according to production needs, not personal influence. It was a new kind of command structure. Capitalism repurposed as strategy, and it worked. The plants ran continuously, their managers improvising through shortages, labor strikes, and changing orders. Leadership on the home front mirrored command on the battlefield, flexible, pragmatic, and fast. When one factory reported a shortage of bearings, another adjusted shipments within hours. The scale was vast, but the coordination was surgical. Knudsen's model would later shape the very concept of the military-industrial complex, but in 1943, it was the reason America could build tanks faster than Panzers could be destroyed. The enemy perspective, shock in the Reich, inside the German high command, disbelief turned to dread. Reports filtered in from the eastern and western fronts, showing an unstoppable rhythm of Allied replacements. Field Marshal Guderian, the father of German armored warfare, wrote bitterly in his wartime notes, "Our victories are consumed by our own shortages. Every destroyed panzer became a logistical catastrophe." Factories in Kassel and Henschel struggled to replace losses, while Allied bombers struck supply lines, fuel depots, and rail networks. Spare parts were scarce. Mechanics salvaged what they could. When Tigers broke down, and they often did, they were abandoned. German generals, accustomed to technological superiority, could not comprehend the American approach. Their tanks outgunned and out-armored the Sherman, yet the battlefield balance kept tilting toward the Allies. It wasn't tactics alone. It was production. A single American factory could turn out more tanks in a month than Germany could in half a year. And when those tanks arrived, they came supported by repair units, spare engines, and fuel convoys, luxuries the Panzer divisions no longer enjoyed. Albert Speer, ever the realist, recognized the impending doom. His memos to Hitler late in 1944 admitted that Allied industrial superiority had become insurmountable. Even if German designs improved, even if they built more factories underground or dispersed them across occupied territory, they could never match the industrial scale of the United States and its partners. By then, Germany was fighting not one enemy, but an entire system, a machine that replaced what it lost before the smoke cleared. The moral and social angle. The unseen revolution. While German society hardened under desperation and control, American society experienced transformation through inclusion. The entrance of women into heavy industry was more than economic necessity. It was social revolution disguised as production. Before the war, women made up less than 1% of heavy industrial workers. By 1944, they accounted for over 1/3 of the nation's defense labor force. This wasn't only in Detroit. Across shipyards, aircraft plants, and munitions factories, millions of women, white, black, Latina, Native, and Asian American, joined the industrial front. In segregated plants, black women fought both racism and sexism, often assigned the hardest, dirtiest jobs for lower pay. Yet their work remained indispensable. The fight for equality within the war effort became the seed of future civil rights movements. The same posters that encouraged women to do their part inadvertently taught them their power. After long shifts, many went home to care for children or aging parents, sleeping only a few hours before returning to the line. Some sent letters to sons or husbands overseas, describing their work proudly. "I built something that might keep you safe." The psychological shift was irreversible. Factories became classrooms of independence. Skills once reserved for men were now universal. When the war ended and millions were laid off, Many refused to return quietly to pre-war domestic life. Thus, the tank lines that broke the Wehrmacht also broke old boundaries. The battle for equality had begun under the sound of drills and welders, not speeches or protests. The story of American tank production was not only mechanical or strategic, it was human, managerial, and morale. Together, these angles explain how a nation that began the war unprepared became the engine that powered Allied victory. From the boardrooms of Detroit to the bunkers of Berlin, one question remained. When would this unstoppable momentum translate into battlefield dominance? Spring 1943, North Africa. The desert shimmered under a punishing sun. Across the dunes of Tunisia, the wreckage of tanks, German, British, and American, lay half buried in sand. The U.S. Army had entered large-scale armored warfare for the first time, and the lessons were brutal. At Kasserine Pass, inexperienced American crews faced veteran Panzer divisions and paid heavily for it. Tigers and Panzer IVs shredded columns of early Shermans and Grants. To many, it seemed the myth of German invincibility was real. But behind those shattered lines, something else was already in motion. Cargo ships unloaded replacement tanks at Algiers, gleaming newly built Shermans, still smelling of paint and grease. Each one bore markings that read Detroit Arsenal or Chrysler Corp. They had crossed the Atlantic faster than German tanks could cross a single continent. Crews received replacements not in months, but in days, and with each loss, the American Army grew wiser. Mechanics learned how to replace transmissions in the field. Welders patched hulls using portable kits. The factories back home listened. Reports from the Ordnance Department fed directly to production lines. Within weeks, design modifications appeared. Thicker armor plates, better cooling systems, improved gun stabilizers. The battlefield and factory floor had merged into a single feedback loop of adaptation. This synchronization between soldier and worker was something the Axis never achieved. While German divisions fought cut off from supply, American units were plugged into an industrial network stretching back across the ocean. Even as the Allies bled in Tunisia, the next generation of armor was already rolling off assembly lines in Michigan and Pennsylvania. By the summer of 1943, the transformation was visible. At El Guetar, American tank battalions advanced again, this time coordinated with artillery and air power. The Shermans, now more numerous, moved in disciplined formations. For every one knocked out, another filled the gap. To the Germans, it was a new kind of war, not won by individual brilliance, but by endless momentum. June 1944, Normandy, France. The thunder of artillery drowned the French countryside. In the first 24 hours after D-Day, Allied forces lost hundreds of tanks to mines, 88mm guns, and panzer ambushes. Yet by dawn on June 7th, replacements were already being landed on the beaches. Cranes swung Shermans from Liberty ships directly onto floating pontoons. By the time German armor attempted to counterattack, new U.S. armored units had already formed up inland. The numbers were staggering. The Allies brought ashore over 15,000 armored vehicles in the first 6 weeks after D-Day. German generals watching from command posts in Caen and Saint-Lô couldn't believe the scale. Intelligence reports suggested that for every German tank destroyed, the Allies could replace 3. It was an attrition equation that the Wehrmacht couldn't sustain. In contrast, the German panzer divisions were starving. The Tiger II, now entering service, was mechanically magnificent and mechanically cursed. Its massive weight tore up roads and bridges. Its fuel consumption was disastrous, and each unit took nearly 2 years of design and refinement. Allied air raids on Kassel and Vienna repeatedly halted production. Meanwhile, in the United States, the lines never stopped. The night shift whistles blew as women poured into plants with lunch pails and thermoses. Sparks cascaded from welding torches like showers of fire. Tanks were tested, painted, shipped, without pause. The rhythm was industrial music, echoing across an ocean. Every tank that rolled out of Detroit or Lima carried a piece of someone's life. The labor of a mother, the precision of a machinist, the oversight of an engineer. When American soldiers climbed into their Shermans on the beaches of Normandy, they carried the combined effort of millions. The Germans began to notice. At Caen, Rommel wrote in frustration, "Their tanks return to the field faster than we can destroy them." What he did not know was that this speed wasn't just logistical, it was cultural. The American system thrived on iteration, not perfection. Tanks could be replaced, soldiers could be retrained, lessons could be implemented. German doctrine sought flawlessness. A tiger had to be perfect. The American machine valued persistence. By July, the Allied advance through Normandy had become a slow, grinding war of attrition. But the production lines back home ensured it was a war Germany could not win. Every week, new divisions were being re-equipped, damaged Shermans repaired, spare engines flown in. It was a scale of supply unseen in human history. From the sands of North Africa to the hedgerows of France, the same truth repeated itself. The nation that could build faster would inevitably outlast the one that could only build beautifully. The tide of war was turning. Not by brilliance of generals, but by the steady hands of welders and riveters half a world away. As summer deepened, the Allies prepared for a final surge across France, one that would shatter the myth of German invincibility once and for all. July-August 1944. Normandy breakout. France. The fields of Normandy were scarred with wreckage, burned-out tanks, splintered hedgerows, and the distant rumble of artillery that never ceased. The Allied advance, bogged down for weeks in tight country, now began to move with frightening speed. Operation Cobra had begun. The key was mobility, and the Sherman was built for it. American engineers had designed its transmission for rapid repair, and its engine for long-distance endurance. On the open plains west of St. Lo, the Sherman surged forward in waves, punching holes through the German lines. Panzers tried to counterattack, but their numbers dwindled daily. The Allies had something Germany could no longer match: a production-fueled rhythm of war. Fuel, ammunition, spare parts, all arrived with mathematical precision. When a tank broke down, it was towed behind the lines, patched up, and returned to combat within days. Captured German crews were stunned to see the same tanks they had disabled back in battle within a week. By late July, General Omar Bradley's forces had broken through the German front. The Americans began a sweeping maneuver toward Avranches and Brittany. Behind them, supply convoys stretched as far as the eye could see. Thousands of trucks carrying rations, munitions, and replacement vehicles. In Germany, Albert Speer's ministry watched the reports with grim clarity. He noted in his diary that industrial power, not tactical skill, now governs this war. The Luftwaffe's fuel reserves were nearly gone, rail lines lay in ruins, and tank factories operated under blackout conditions. The Reich was running out of both machines and men to build them. At the Falaise pocket, August 1944, the collapse became visible. Over 50,000 German troops were encircled and destroyed. Dozens of panzer divisions ceased to exist as coherent units. Allied armor, overwhelmingly Sherman-based, pressed forward relentlessly. Where Tigers bogged down, Shermans maneuvered. Where Panthers needed complex repairs, American tanks swapped out parts in minutes. Each day the U.S. Army's advance was measured not just in miles, but in shipments. Supply trains and Liberty ships ensured that combat losses were irrelevant to momentum. This was the full realization of America's industrial doctrine. Continuous replacement equals unstoppable offense. Autumn 1944. The Siegfried Line and beyond. The Germans retreated behind their last fortified belt, the Siegfried Line. There, among concrete dragons' teeth and pillboxes, they hoped to stall the Allied push. They still believed the coming winter might slow production and halt the offensive. But Detroit did not sleep in winter. Back in Michigan, the night shifts continued. Steam rose from the factory roofs as snow fell outside. Women in heavy coats still reported to work before dawn, tightening bolts, welding seams, and stamping serial numbers on armor plates destined for Europe. War bonds hung beside Christmas decorations. Fatigue was everywhere, but so was pride. Every 58 minutes, another Sherman rolled off the line. It would be shipped to Newark, loaded onto a freighter, and cross the Atlantic in convoy. Some would arrive in Le Havre, others in Antwerp. Within days, they were fighting through the forests of the Ardennes. There, in December 1944, the final German gamble began. The Battle of the Bulge. Hitler's armored counteroffensive smashed into the Allied lines under cover of fog and snow. The Panzer Lehr Division, the 2nd SS Panzer, and others launched their last assault. American units were caught off guard. Entire columns were wiped out in the first days. But the counterattack had a fatal flaw. It relied on logistics Germany no longer possessed. Fuel was scarce, replacement tanks non-existent, and every destroyed vehicle was an irreplaceable loss. When the weather cleared, Allied air power returned, and with it, the resupply. Hundreds of fresh Shermans rolled forward from depots near Liège and Namur. Mechanics worked in the snow, refueling and rearming tanks for the next day's push. German crews, short on ammunition, abandoned their Panzers when fuel ran out. By January 1945, the offensive had failed. The snow-covered Ardennes was littered with burnt tigers and panthers, their black hulls frozen in place. American forces advanced again, their losses already replaced. In a speech to factory workers that same month, President Roosevelt summarized what the world had witnessed. The arsenal of democracy has proved itself mightier than the engines of tyranny. From the deserts of Africa to the forests of Europe, the outcome was decided not only by courage, but by capacity. The Germans built masterpieces. The Americans built armies. The industrial pulse that began with the first tank at the Detroit Arsenal now echoed across 2 continents. Every tank that reached the front line represented a victory of process, organization, and faith in ordinary citizens doing extraordinary things. When the Allies crossed the Rhine in March 1945, thousands of Shermans rolled across pontoon bridges into the heart of Germany. Behind them came the engineers, mechanics, and supply convoys, all manifestations of the same force. A production machine so vast that even the Reich's best could not comprehend it. And as German generals looked out over their shattered armor, they finally understood the true weapon the United States had unleashed. It was not a gun, nor a tank, nor a bomb, but an idea. That industrial democracy, mobilized at full strength, could outbuild and outlast any dictatorship on earth. The end was now inevitable. Spring 1945. Germany's industrial heart lay silent. Ruhr steelworks, once glowing with molten fire, now stood cold under Allied control. Bombed rail lines twisted across valleys. Factories that once forged Panzers were little more than hollow shells filled with rubble and soot. For the German war machine, production had simply ceased to exist. Across the Atlantic, the picture was the exact opposite. The Detroit Arsenal tank plant still roared, its furnaces burning through the night even as the European war neared its end. The lines did not stop because no one yet knew when the fighting would truly cease. And the Pacific War loomed ahead. By the end of 1945, the United States had built more than 88,000 medium and heavy tanks, nearly 200,000 armored vehicles, and over 300,000 aircraft. The Detroit Arsenal alone accounted for more tanks than Germany, Italy, and Japan combined. It was a scale of output unmatched in world history. The workers who achieved it, many of them women, began to sense that something enormous was ending. The overtime whistles still blew, but with an air of uncertainty. Soldiers overseas were writing home about surrender talks. Rumors spread through the factories. Berlin has fallen. Hitler is dead. It's over. On May 8, 1945, Victory in Europe Day, production finally slowed. Some plants held ceremonies. At the Detroit Arsenal, a massive American flag was hung from the overhead cranes. Workers gathered on the shop floor, still wearing oil-stained coveralls, to listen to Roosevelt's successor, President Truman, declare victory. For a moment, silence replaced the machinery. Then, as if on cue, the whistles screamed again. One last time. For the women who had built those machines, it was both triumph and loss. They had proven themselves in every way: welders, foremen, machinists, inspectors. Yet within weeks, layoffs began. Returning veterans reclaimed their industrial positions, and millions of women were told to go home. Many did, reluctantly. Others resisted, having tasted independence and purpose for the first time. Historians would later call it the Quiet Revolution. The war had rewritten the possibilities of gender and labor in America. The seeds planted on those assembly lines would grow into the movements of the 1950s and 60s. But at that moment, what remained was exhaustion. A welder named Elsie Rod, interviewed at the time, said simply, "We built them fast because our boys needed them. Now they're coming home. That's enough for me." For Germany, the reckoning came in statistics as cold as steel. From 1941 to 1945, total German tank production barely reached 46,000, fewer than half the number of Shermans built. The Reich had expended its finest engineers and metallurgists, crafting mechanical masterpieces it could no longer afford to replace. Speer admitted in his memoirs that each destroyed Tiger was a national tragedy. In contrast, American losses were expected, calculated, and instantly replenished. The very concept of acceptable attrition, once unthinkable in warfare, became feasible only because of industrial depth. The Allies could lose thousands of tanks and continue advancing. Germany could lose hundreds and never recover. The numbers told the story. Detroit Arsenal Tank Plant, 22,134 tanks built. Pressed Steel Car Company, 21,000 tanks and armored hulls. Fisher Body Division, 19,000 tanks. Baldwin Locomotive Works, 10,000. Together, they represented an alliance of engineering and endurance unmatched before or since. By war's end, even German prisoners of war marveled at their captors' production might. One engineer reportedly said, "We designed the perfect machines, but you Americans built the endless ones." In that statement lay the entire moral of the conflict. Design brilliance was powerless without sustainability. The factories that had once echoed with the sound of hammers and welding torches now shifted to peacetime production. Cars, tractors, refrigerators. But for a generation, the memory of that thunderous wartime rhythm would never fade. It had built not just tanks, but victory itself. The war in Europe was over, but the legacy of America's industrial miracle was only beginning. As the guns of Europe fell silent, the industrial war entered a new phase. Transition. America's enormous wartime apparatus could not simply shut down overnight. Hundreds of thousands of workers, engineers, and machinists still reported for duty, uncertain whether their skills would be needed in peace. The federal government faced a daunting question: what to do with an economy built for destruction? The answer lay in conversion, turning the arsenal of democracy into the engine of post-war prosperity. By mid-1945, contracts were canceled by the thousands. Tank plants switched to peacetime production almost immediately. The Detroit Arsenal began retooling for civilian vehicles and heavy construction equipment. Chrysler engineers who had once optimized armor plate thickness now redesigned frames for tractors and buses. Assembly lines that once echoed with the clang of war soon produced the hum of consumer industry. Yet, amid the relief of peace, something else lingered: a deep recognition of what had been achieved. Historians and generals alike understood that industrial organization, not battlefield brilliance, had carried the Allies to victory. General Eisenhower called America's production power the truly decisive factor. British historian Basil Liddell Hart wrote that logistics triumphed where strategy faltered. Even in defeated Germany, admiration and envy replaced disbelief. In post-war interrogations, former officers and industrialists marveled at the scale of U.S. output. One engineer from Henschel confessed, "We never fought just an army. We fought a machine, a factory with a flag. That machine became the blueprint for the modern world." The command structures of wartime production evolved into peacetime management science. Systems engineering, operations research, and supply chain theory were born from these factories. The flowcharts once used to move steel and rivets now guided post-war corporations, airlines, and eventually the space program. The social echoes were equally profound. Millions of women left the factories, but not the workforce entirely. Many found new jobs in offices, laboratories, and schools. The confidence they gained during the war permanently altered the cultural fabric. Rosie the Riveter faded as propaganda, but endured as symbol, proof that American democracy could adapt faster than tyranny. For the men returning from Europe and the Pacific, the sight of these transformed factories carried its own emotion. They had driven, fought, and sometimes died inside machines built by people they would never meet. When they came home and saw those same workers leaving the gates at shift's end, the connection was complete. In 1946, with production redirected and rationing lifted, the United States experienced an economic surge without precedent. The same assembly lines that had once produced tanks now filled driveways with cars and kitchens with appliances. What had been the world's deadliest industrial network became its most prosperous. Germany's surviving industrialists, meanwhile, rebuilt under Allied supervision. Ironically, many adopted the very methods that had defeated them. Mass standardization, modular manufacturing, and statistical quality control. The factories of West Germany's economic miracle in the 1950s owed much to lessons learned from the arsenal that crushed them. For the American women who once welded armor plate at midnight, memories of the war never faded. Some kept their badges, pay stubs, and photographs beside ration books and victory pins. They knew they had been part of something vast, something history might never fully comprehend. By the late 1940s, the echo of wartime production had faded into the steady rhythm of peace. But every highway built, every car produced, and every university laboratory funded by wartime research was part of the same legacy. An industrial civilization born in the smoke and flame of total war. The arsenal of democracy had done more than win a conflict. It had changed the way humanity thought about power itself, proving that the ability to build, organize, and adapt was the truest weapon of all. The factories were quiet now, but their story was far from over. In the end, it wasn't a tank, a general, or a single battle that broke the back of the Axis. It was the rhythm of production, the hum of factories, the tireless hands that refused to stop. The Second World War proved that power in the modern age no longer belonged solely to armies. It belonged to those who could sustain them. Germany's engineers built wonders, machines of breathtaking precision and lethal beauty. But they built too few. America's workers built machines of endurance, not perfection, but they built them endlessly. That difference reshaped history. In the Detroit Arsenal tank plant, when the last Sherman rolled off the line in 1945, workers paused to sign its armor. Grease-stained hands scrawled names, initials, small prayers. It was a moment of quiet pride, a farewell to a war they had fought not with rifles, but with wrenches. Those signatures represented something profound: democracy's ability to mobilize itself, without dictatorship, without fear, without secret police, through organization, education, and belief in a shared cause. Ordinary citizens had defeated one of the most industrialized tyrannies on earth. The lesson endures. The battlefields of the 20th century taught that courage wins moments, but production wins wars. The people who stood in those factories, who learned overnight to weld armor and calibrate precision parts, did more than build tanks. They built the idea that freedom could outproduce fear. In the years that followed, the world rebuilt from their effort. Highways, schools, and industries rose on the foundations of wartime organization. The roar of the assembly line became the heartbeat of the modern age, proof that the hands which forged weapons could just as easily forge peace. So when historians write of generals and battles, they often miss the deeper truth. Victory was born not only in the fields of Normandy or the ruins of Berlin, but in the dim glow of factory lights in Detroit, Cleveland, and Chicago, where women worked through the night to ensure that liberty would never run out of steel. The war ended, but their echo never did. It still hums, steady, proud, unbroken, in the legacy of those who built faster than tyranny could burn. History was written not only by generals, but by the hands that built their armies. If stories like this move you, subscribe now to uncover more untold truths from the battlefields, the factories, and the forgotten corners of World War II. Turn on notifications because every week, another piece of history comes back to life. Like, share, and comment if you believe the power of ordinary people can change the course of the world.